This is the ASUS Flow Z13, and it's one of the most interesting tech products in 2025 so far. Not only is this a premium gaming tablet, which in itself is somewhat uncommon, but it also comes with a brand new chipset from AMD that has an enormous amount of potential, not just for gaming, but for anything creative or resource intensive. On top of that, there's a whole host of things that you can tweak and customize, and today I'm digging into what the last week has looked like in my own use with this machine, good and bad. So if you're in the market for a portable gaming PC with loads of potential, or maybe you're looking for a Mac alternative for a creative workflow, you're gonna want to stick around for this one. With that said, let's get into it. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. The ASUS Flow Z13 is one of the latest Windows-based laptops or tablets to get a major chip upgrade, which we've seen a lot of over the last year or so. Last spring, Qualcomm came out with the new ARM-based Snapdragon X series chips that were in a bunch of Windows laptops. Those machines were largely aimed at taking on Apple Silicon, and I would say made a pretty big leap forward when it came to performance and efficiency, but I found to be somewhat lacking when it came to GPU performance and compatibility. And the AMD processor in the Flow Z13 has no shortage of either of those things. Inside here, you'll find the newly released Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 chipset, which will supposedly outperform some pretty powerful desktop chips and components in some key areas. And the fact that it's a mobile chip and you can fit it into a form factor like this is even more impressive. This is a tablet design very similar to a Surface Pro in some aspects, with a detachable magnetic keyboard cover, but this has a full aluminum chassis with a really well-built solid metal hinge that overall has a great retro-futuristic aesthetic to it, with a little transparent RGB window that illuminates the motherboard inside. I absolutely love this design, as it does give a nice balance between a sci-fi look and a functional design that's not too overbearing, and I wish that more companies would try things like this. It is a touch towards the thicker side for a tablet at around 13mm, but I actually don't mind the thickness here, as it does fit into the overall look nicely. That said, the thing that I wish was a little bit better here is that detachable keyboard case. That is plastic, and it doesn't feel like it has the same level of build quality versus everything else. The trackpad I'm not a huge fan of. It's not loose by any means, but it doesn't have a great tactile feeling, and there are some surface inconsistencies near the top of the keyboard that visually don't look the greatest. I think it may have made sense to use aluminum there as well, or just made this a tad more sturdy. I know it is only a keyboard cover, and normally I probably wouldn't say anything about this, but this does come with a price tag starting at $2,300 USD or 3,000 Canadian, so I do think it is important to note. That is really my only complaint design-wise though, and for the most part, this is made up of premium components that look and feel outstanding. Even the glass on the front display is great. That is made up of Gorilla Glass 5 with a DXC coating that does a decent job at reducing reflections. I'm not going to test how scratch resistant it is for obvious reasons, but I much prefer a glossy finish on a display like this with a higher pixel density, where the screen on here is a 13.4-inch IPS panel with a 2560 by 1600 resolution. Now, because this is an IPS panel, the black levels aren't going to be as deep as a mini LED or an OLED display, but this does have some pretty great specs nonetheless. This goes up to 500 nits peak brightness, which is what I would expect to see in an IPS, but it's got a 180Hz variable refresh rate with a 3 millisecond response time and is insanely color accurate as well. ASUS says this covers 100% of the P3 gamut, where in my own testing it's been at 99%, which is still fantastic, and they also advertise a contrast ratio of 1500:1, where the one that I have here was just shy of that at about 1440:1. But honestly, anything above 1100:1 on an IPS panel is very good. There is some very minor variations in black uniformity where you can see some slight edge bleed if you really look for it, but nothing that I would be overly concerned with. While gaming and doing anything on here for that matter, everything feels smooth and fluid with nice vibrant colors that really pop. The Flow Z13 also supports Dolby Vision HDR on the video side of things, so you get great overall dynamic range and contrast while watching media. And because this is very color accurate and is a touchscreen, naturally it lends itself to doing any creative work, which I think this chipset is largely marketed for, and for good reason. Doing things like video editing, 3D modeling, and even photo editing at times can be pretty resource intensive, and in large part, this machine handles them no problem. The AMD Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 in here is a brand new mobile APU, and within it, you've got a 16-core 32-thread CPU running at 5.1 GHz, an integrated Radeon 8060S GPU featuring 40 RDNA 3.5 compute units, and integrated LPDDR5 XRAM up to 128 gigs, where you can allocate up to 96 gigs to the GPU. In benchmarks, with the operating mode set to turbo, which I am going to come back to in a minute, Geekbench scores are just under 3,000 in single-core and 21,000 in multi-core, putting it near the top of the charts with PC chips, and it is quite similar to the recent Apple M4 Pro chip. The GPU is a little harder to test, where I can run a GPU test in Geekbench that puts this somewhere in the neighborhood of an RTX 2080 GPU in terms of performance, but I can't effectively test the GPU in tools like Cinebench yet, which I am assuming is because this does have that integrated GPU with adjustable memory allocation. That is controlled within the AMD Adrenalin or Armory Crate app, and within there, you can see that I've got a dashboard with all the current system specs and the operating modes that I referenced earlier. Right now I've got this set up so that when I'm running off the battery, it's set to silent mode, which uses less system resources, so it is conserving more battery life, and when I'm plugged in, that'll switch to turbo mode, where a couple things happen automatically. The first change is instantly noticeable, where you'll see the screen go from 60 to 180 Hz, the response time will increase, and you'll see the chipset ramp up the power usage. I was kind of hoping that the RAM allocation might switch here as well, but that requires a restart, so you've got to set that manually, and it will affect how much system RAM that you have. So on this particular machine, which has 32 gigs of total RAM, if you've got 8 of that allocated to the GPU, you'll only see 24 available on your system. Now, I can change that allocation to whatever I want, but I find anything past 8 gigs doesn't really do you any good. And I can also scale the power or the wattage manually if I want to, adjust the RGB lighting on the keyboard or on that rear display window, and a host of other things. So there is a lot of flexibility with this chipset, and it has one significant advantage over some other new mobile chips coming out. These AI Max chips are built on a traditional x86 architecture, so you don't have to worry about any compatibility issues with games or apps within Windows, which is a huge benefit over an ARM chip, especially if you're a gamer. I can play pretty much any title that I want to on here. In turbo mode at full resolution, I'm getting between 50 and 70 frames per second, and Cyberpunk and Avowed on fairly high settings. And when you turn on frame generation, things play very smooth. If I go down to 1080p, I can get a solid 70 FPS in those games without frame generation, and play most games between high and ultra settings, and the experience is very similar to a desktop PC with a decent mid-range GPU, which is outstanding. The Flow Z13 does have a dual fan setup and a redesigned vapor chamber inside that is very effective and keeps the machine running cool, although you will hear those fans most of the time while running in turbo mode or doing anything graphically intensive. Turbo mode is only available when this device is plugged in, and the catch with this machine is that in performance mode, which is the highest performing mode available on the battery, you will see a decrease in performance where the CPU drops 4 to 6% in benchmarks, as do most other components, and you will have to dial back the settings a little bit to maintain the same high frame rates, but even then, this thing is still more than capable. When it comes to creative tasks with video editing, I've been able to have a 4K timeline open in DaVinci Resolve with 10-bit H.265 footage, with relatively no lag, that in some cases exports faster than my M4 Pro Mac Mini, which is pretty impressive. The same goes for 3D work, where Blender performance is usually quite impressive, but occasionally you'll hit a snag. I'm assuming this will get better with updates, and trying out the beta version did seem to make a bit of difference, but the exports that I tried were about a minute slower than my desktop with an RTX 4070, which I would consider pretty quick. In fact, just using this machine, I don't find it feels a whole lot different than my desktop PC or my MacBook M4 Pro if it's plugged in and in turbo mode, and even performance mode isn't far behind, where, yeah, you can see some of those render times drawn out a bit, but it's still a great little companion for creative professionals. Now, seeing as this does have AI in the name, a big part of this chipset is geared towards AI, and to be completely honest, I don't do a whole lot with LLMs or anything, but I did try and test this out, but again, this seems like it might be a little too early to fully know how good this chipset will be, due to lack of support right now. Coding, on the other hand, is something that I've had a lot of success with, where this is super smooth regardless of what I'm doing, with quick build times and no lag. And a big plus to a tablet like this is, say if I'm developing an Android app, I can utilize that touch functionality within the emulator, which can be helpful. I sometimes forget that this is technically a tablet and does have some tablet-like features like front and rear cameras. The rear camera is a 13 megapixel sensor that I probably wouldn't ever use, where the front is 5 megapixels and combined with a built-in 3 mic array, works decent enough for calls or meetings. And I just really like that you can use this in pretty much any way that you want, and you don't have to sacrifice any kind of compatibility. Another great thing about this, say if you're doing a ton of stuff on here and your storage fills up fast, which isn't hard to do these days, the 1TB SSD included is replaceable, which is definitely nice to have. That SSD is an M.2 2230 drive that runs on PCIe 4.0 and is pretty fast, very similar to other premium PCs or laptops, but like I said earlier, the speed will cut in half going from turbo to performance mode, but for the most part, the Z13 feels like a desktop PC in a really small package. For someone like me who doesn't game as much as I used to, but does a wide variety of tasks, I could probably get rid of my PC tower and replace it with something like this and still have roughly the same experience. This does have an HDMI 2.1 port, so you can hook this up to high-resolution displays with high refresh rates, and you also get one USB-A port capable of 10 gigabit per second speeds, a micro SD card slot, and two USB 4 Type-C ports capable of 40 gigabit speeds with power delivery and DisplayPort support. So in the event that maybe you want to hook up a secondary monitor here, using that port will achieve that. Or say if you have a monitor that supports USB-C with power delivery built in, you'll only need one cable to effectively power the Flow Z13 and export the display signal. Speaking of power, probably one of the most important aspects of this machine is gonna be the battery life, where the Flow Z13 has a 70 watt-hour battery that does an okay job, depending on what mode you have it in. In silent mode, just casually using it for web browsing and watching media, I can get around 9 hours out of it. That's alright, but nothing on the level of ARM-based PCs or MacBooks, and with super heavy workloads where you're basically maxing out everything on here, the Z13 will suck back the power in an hour to an hour and a half, so I'd definitely be bringing your AC adapter with you if you're mobile. With mixed use, you're going to be in between those numbers depending on what you do, and I am kind of hoping that this does get optimized over time, because this is built on a 4nm process, so I would think that this should be able to more effectively save on battery life, even with somewhat of a small battery, but it's still quite usable nonetheless. Finally, the last thing that I want to talk about is wireless connectivity, because chances are, if you're serious about using a machine like this on a full-time basis, you'll probably end up with some wireless accessories. Sticking strictly to that keyboard case probably isn't going to cut it, and you do get the latest and greatest in that regard. The Flow Z13 comes packed with triple band Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.4, where I've been getting fantastic speeds throughout my house, regardless of where I've been using it. And any Bluetooth devices like keyboards, mice, headphones, and controllers have worked perfectly with no connection issues or drops. Honestly, just strictly speaking from a functional standpoint, the Flow Z13 has been quite impressive. I still think that there are some issues to iron out in terms of GPU compatibility, but any games that I've played on here have been smooth without skipping a beat, and I could definitely see putting my entire workflow on here. Sure, I would like to see that keyboard case improved a little bit, and the battery life isn't the greatest out there, but all in all, this is a really solid machine with a very well-built, unique design. That being said, I know for a lot of folks, using something like this may be a bit of a departure from what they're used to using, so I would love to know. If you're on a Mac now, or a traditional x86 laptop, or maybe you're on a legit desktop PC that you use for gaming, could you ever see yourself switching to something like this? Let me know in the comments down below, because I am curious, and I definitely think that there is a lot of potential here, especially with this form factor. That's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video or you found it useful. If you did, feel free to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more tech-related content or help me design an RGB desk lamp that only turns on or off by playing the 1998 Godzilla soundtrack, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.